Welcome back to Oz and Elsewhere, and in this video I wanted to talk about books I've read recently that have the same vibe as this meme. For those of you that are blessed to not be as chronically online as I am, let me just quickly explain this meme. I don't think it has an official name, but people call it the girls when meme because usually you'll see it with these kind of violent images outside and then a text in the middle depicting a typical kind of quote-unquote girly thing, such as girls when they fall in love. And the point is to show that girlhood isn't just sugar and spice and everything nice. A lot of times the feelings associated with girlhood are a lot closer to the rage, pain, violent shaking, throwing up portrayed in this meme. So here are a few books I thought I read recently that reminded me of this, and apologies to serious literary critics. So the first book I wanted to talk about is by Ani Erno. It's called, I read it in Croatian, it's called Djevojačke uspomene in Croatian. It was translated in English as A Girl's Story. So the book follows Ani during the summer that she turned 18 and worked as a camp counselor. And at this camp, she had a kind of her first real romantic sexual experience with an older camp counselor that led to her being ostracized by the rest of the camp. This was 1958 after all, and really judged and shamed. But at the same time, her experience at the camp and her first experience kind of not being at home, not being with her parents, was very liberatory and independent and shaped her going forward. And the book is it zooms in a lot on these complex feelings of shame and desire, of liberty and rejection, of independence, and the desperation to be wanted and loved. And it's a very painful read. Although Erno doesn't explicitly say it, it's clear that this episode was actually fairly traumatic for her, and it was something that maybe a modern feminist would say falls into a kind of consent gray zone. And I think the fact that it was traumatic and difficult is shown by the fact that she only wrote about this when she was 76. And she states in the book repeatedly that she found it very difficult to return to this topic. And this is an author that is kind of famous for her very unflinching portrayals of difficult moments in her own life, such as the abortion she got before it was even legal in France, which shows just how traumatic this passage from girlhood into womanhood can be, and how difficult it can be to revisit that moment, even if there are positive feelings, and even if it did at the time feel as if it was a positive step forward. Now, the second I read Erno, I immediately thought of Elena Ferrante, and really no discussion on girlhood in literature can be complete without talking about Elena Ferrante, and specifically her Neapolitan Quartet. So I have the first book in the quartet here, also in Croatian, and I was not a fan of this translation. So in Croatian it's translated as Genijalna prijateljica. In English, that's My Brilliant Friend. And the first book follows these two girls, Lila and Lenu, as they grow up in a poor Neapolitan neighborhood. And this theme of girlhood continues into the second book, The Story of a New Name, which marks kind of the passage for girlhood into young womanhood. For Lenu, that means getting an education and leaving the neighborhood and leaving Naples entirely and attempting to reinvent herself as someone new. Well, for Lila, the reality is a bit more constrained, as she was not allowed to continue school past the 4th grade. It means getting married at 16 and escaping a violent, abusive husband and trying to escape the box that the neighborhood has put her into and wants her to fit into, and that she spent her whole life kind of trying to escape. And what's interesting is that these books often get praised for their depiction of female friendship, but I read this essay recently in N+1 about Elena Ferrante, where the author Dana Todorici, I think that's her name, talks about how, just this very cutesy term of female friendship isn't enough to depict the psychically complex bond between Lenu and Lila. They're very competitive, which helps them push past their boundaries, but it also means they're often quite cruel to each other and that they don't see the problems the other has. So, for example, Lenu looks at Lila getting married at 16 and doesn't think, oh wow, my friend is getting married to this boy that I know doesn't come from a very nice family. I hope she's all right. She's instead furious that Lila is, maturing faster than her, has entered womanhood, has won that bit of competition, and that eventually, feeling as if she has lost the competition, eventually pushes Lanu to sleep. This is a spoiler for the second book, to sleep with the father of a classmate that sexually harassed her because she doesn't want Lila to get ahead. And I think that's what I really love about these books, is they really focus on the ugly parts of girlhood, that competition, that being torn between feeling as if you'll never be good enough and wanting so desperately to be better than anyone else. And I think that's really kind of what drives this relationship between Lila and Lenu, not just kind of this very cutesy view of female friendship. And the last book I wanted to talk about is definitely a lot less popular in international spheres, mostly because it hasn't been translated into English yet. It's this Croatian novel called Psi by Dora Šustić. I don't have it in a physical copy, unfortunately, which I kind of regret. So this novel follows a 20-year-old Croatian student who goes to study film in Prague. And while she's there, she meets and falls in love with a 39-year-old widower and begins this very intense relationship with him that eventually has they eventually break up, of course, but it winds up having a very tragic end. And this book actually was part of a very strange literary scandal in the Croatian feminist world, where when it was being promoted at a literary festival in the author's native city, they decided it would be a good idea to put her on a panel with another male author with two male moderators, just because the other guy had also written a book where a young woman gets in a relationship with an older guy, and they kind of turned the whole panel into a, men can't write about older men lusting after young girls anymore without getting canceled, which was a very bizarre interpretation to take away from this book. And one thing I found really interesting is, so in Croatian, the word nevina has two meanings. It can mean a virgin, and it can also mean an innocent. So the main character of this book isn't a virgin when she meets Leon, her lover, but she is very innocent. And the relationship means kind of the stripping away of her innocence. She repeats a lot in the book about how she, never had anything bad happen to her before, and then you read the book and it's like, okay, now you're making up for lost time. Through this relationship, she is, loses her friends, she abandons her friends, she develops severe physical and mental health issues, she completely loses herself and becomes codependent. She even loses all her money because she's paying for this man's rent. And it uses the structure of an unreliable narrator where throughout the whole book she's saying, oh, I felt so much power over him because he wanted me. But really, as the reader, you realize how little power she actually has in this situation. And that brings me to kind of what these books all had in common, which is that in all three books, the transition from girlhood to womanhood is marked by some kind of relationship with a man. but it's never just about the man. The main character or the narrator always seeks out the relationship with the man because she wants something else. She wants independence. She wants to feel power. She wants to enter this world of desire. She wants social capital, to be seen as someone who can be with a man. Sometimes what she really wants is attention from other women and respect from other women, saying, oh wow, okay, yes, you are now one of us. But that doesn't mean that they're using the man, that they're the ones in the position of power. Which brings me to what I really wanted to say with this video, which is that girlhood, as described in literature and as experienced in real life, girlhood is a state of coercion. What you thought, because there was a meme in the thumbnail, this was going to be fun. So much of girlhood, whether in literature or in real life, at least according to my own experiences, is about having control snatched away from you because you're both young and female. And that control is taken away from you even more if you are, say, racialized, or like Ferrante's character is growing up in poverty. And there are so many layers of control on young girls that these characters, and also real girls, kind of throw off that most direct layer of control and go into rebellion against that, but don't even realize the extent of the indirect mechanisms of control, the pressure, the crushing weight of societal expectations, and then that rebellion against that first direct parental authority still follows expected paths for a girl, or what a young woman looks like. And that's why I said girlhood is a state of coercion, because even when you strip away that layer of the most direct controlling force, there are so many other control mechanisms that when you're young are impossible to figure out. And then you may think you have independent actions and that you're doing something to prove your independence, but what you're really doing is you're still doing what society wants you to do. And you can see that in the actions of Annie Ernaux in her autobiographical book. You can see that in the actions of Lenu or Dora in Psy. And so first of all, for all of these characters, that first step towards freedom, what they experienced as freedom, still came through a relationship with a man. And that's not so much freedom as it is what is expected of girls once they give up girlhood and become women. So none of them kind of find their freedom at first in their work or in their friendships. Instead, they see that a necessary step towards maturity is a relationship with a man. Second of all of these girls wind up in relationships that are, quite frankly, predatory. All three have relationships between, whether that's just a sexual encounter or an extended romantic relationship between younger girls and much older men who hold the control in that relationship, who sometimes physically are much stronger than the girls they're with, who have the power, in Annie's case, who have the power to destroy this girl's reputation among her peers while he walks away unscathed, who are quite literally old enough to be the girl's father in Lenu's situation in Ferrante's novel, who in Psy, it's not such a direct manifestation, mainly because the narrator herself very much feels love for this man that she is with, And she doesn't describe it as a controlling relationship. But the reader can see just how much she strips her own agency away, and she allows herself to become insecure. She welcomes in that insecurity. She welcomes in portraying herself as a blank slate to let his own experiences write their story on her. So even through her independence, her step towards adulthood, she realizes she's giving up part of herself in this very unequal relationship. And what's interesting is, as I said, for all of these characters, they unquestioningly, for them, that first step towards maturity is a relationship with a man. But in 2 of these 3 novels, there is some examination of why that was so. And there are some themes of what today modern scholars call compulsory heterosexuality, which is what many bisexual or even lesbian women experience before they come out and even after they come out, which is the pressure to be with a man because it is socially acceptable and kind of suppress your own romantic and sexual desires. So in C, or Dogs, a major theme of the book is that the narrator has had many sexual relationships with men, but she's never satisfied with them. She has never orgasmed before. And she mentions in passing that the only time she's done so has been with a woman, but has chosen never to explain that part of her sexuality. So even though this book takes place in 21st century, it is in Croatia, but in a very liberal echelon of Croatian society, the narrator still, has completely cut off that part of herself and just walked into a relationship with a man. And we also get mention of this in Elena Ferrante in the 3rd or 4th book, I forget which one it is. Leno briefly mentions how, the most intense relationship in her life has been with Lila, and she wonders if they knew that such a thing was possible when they were growing up in Naples in the 50s. Would they have been together instead of basically ruining their lives with men? So kind of this idea that girlhood is a state of coercion, we find proof in that in the fact that so much of Gothic literature, so much so that there's a subset of this literature called female Gothic, is kind of follows young women on the cusp of adulthood, on this transitional period between girlhood and womanhood. And a lot of the horrors of Gothic literature is of this young girl / woman realizing, kind of having an extremely traumatic passage from girlhood into womanhood, and realizing just how constraining the expectations of her are, and just how, and in a way, the Gothic offers the only escape. So one example is the book Rebecca, which follows a narrator that remains unnamed throughout the whole book, and her wedding and her marriage to an older widower who winds up having a very strange relationship with his deceased ex-wife. And that kind of her realization that, she really was young and she didn't know what she was getting into, and this situation is a lot creepier than she thought it was, is so Gothic and so an exaggerated version of so many stories of young women marrying men and then realizing what they kind of got themselves into. Another more explicit example is found in The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. I'm not sure if this completely falls into Gothic literature, as it's a bit more modern, but I think it does. And in the titular short story, The Bloody Chamber, Angela Carter offers a retelling of the Bluebeard fairy tale, which, if you don't know, that's a fairy tale where this very rich man marries a young girl, and he tells her, You have the run of the castle, there's just one room that you can't look into, and eventually curiosity gets the better of her, and she looks into that room and finds it's the bodies of all his previous ex-wives, because he killed them after looking into this room. So the Bloody Chamber is a retelling of this fairy tale. And literally, let me just read the first paragraph to you. I remember how that night I lay awake in the wagon lit in a tender, delicious ecstasy of excitement, my burning cheek pressed against the impeccable linen of the pillow, and the pounding of my heart mimicking that of the great piston ceaselessly thrusting the train that bore me through the night, away from Paris, away from girlhood, away from the white enclosed quietude of my mother's apartment, into the unguessable country of marriage. So although there's excitement, there's illicit thrill, there is very real desire and a bit of freedom in the fact that after leaving this constrained state of girlhood, the narrator is able to act on realizing those desires instead of suppressing them as she has been taught. Her journey from girlhood, from the safety of her mother's home, winds up leading her into dangers and horrors that she could not have possibly imagined. And I don't think Gothic literature would have found such fertile ground in portraying this horrific, traumatic rupture as young girls grow into women if so many young girls through the ages hadn't felt the same way. Maybe not so much, dark castles, dark stormy nights, husbands with literal bodies in the closet, but more mundane horrors of the kind of domestic violence that the village just looks away from because it's accepted. The crushing expectation of giving up the rest of your life for the good of your husband and children, and the knowledge that you could have done more, but you were not allowed to. So it's no wonder that the state of girlhood, before all these realizations of just how few your options are, winds up becoming a bit romanticized when that movement away from that state is often so traumatic. So if girlhood is this state of coercion where you're subject to physical and mental control directly and indirectly, and societal pressures, and the end of it is necessarily traumatic, is girlhood redeemable? I think looking at current trends in pop culture, it has to be, given the prevalence of girl-related kind of internet memes and trends and grown women referring to themselves as girls. Clearly there is something about this state that people find nostalgic and willing to return to. And I mean, more fluent internet culture writers than myself have examined this in detail. But I was thinking about this when I read the last book I wanted to talk about, which is Olga Dies Dreaming by Xochitl Gonzalez. So this book doesn't really fit with the rest of the trends for a few reasons. So Olga, first of all, isn't a girl. She is a woman in her early 40s. She has left girlhood far behind. And the book follows Olga and her brother, who grew up in a Puerto Rican family in New York, as they kind of navigate the fallout of Hurricane Maria and their mother re-entering their life after she abandoned them when they were both children to kind of go be a revolutionary in Puerto Rico. So what's interesting is that I found Olga's trajectory in the book to be a kind of reverse journey from this journey of girlhood into womanhood and this traumatic rupture I described in all these other books. So Olga starts out the book as this high-powered businesswoman running a wedding planning agency for the filthy rich, and she's hyper competent. As a coping mechanism, her focus is just making money so that her family can depend on her. She doesn't want to show weakness. She's not about to confide in anyone. She doesn't seem to have very many close friends. She flees all romantic relationships. It's just about staying strong, making money, making sure her family has someone to depend on, and kind of suppressing all these bad things in her life. And then her trajectory is about kind of unpacking all the things she suppressed, such as the way her morals and her kind of pride in her Puerto Rican identity clash with her profession, planning weddings for people that really treat her poorly and are responsible for really bad things happening to her community. But on a personal level, her trajectory is about relearning vulnerability, softness, asking for help, and centrally learning to believe in romance again. All things that are central to girlhood. Because that's the interesting thing, is romance is seen as a girly thing, not a womanly thing. Even though, romantic relationships, that's something adults do, but it's something girls want. Because as a woman, because romance is seen as frivolous. Once you become a woman, you're supposed to kind of put that away and not want more, and not want the big romantic relationship with the person who will treat you right and see you for who you fully are. But you're just supposed to want kind of whatever happens and start a family and do your job. It's a bit of a digression. So Olga's whole trajectory is about relearning these softer values and allowing herself to find love and allowing herself to believe in love and that she is deserving of it, which mark a kind of return to girlhood. And I found that very interesting in tandem with these other books, partially because it shows the values of girlhood and the values of kind of holding on to these wants and these softer parts of yourself even when the world tries to beat it out of you. And I think it's also a interesting commentary on who gets to stay a girl. So Annie in her autobiography freely admits that even though she grew up in a lower middle class family, she was a bit spoiled. So that's why she was so sheltered when she went away at 18. Dora in Dogs, or C, also comes from a fairly sheltered, white, upper class Croatian family, which is why she's able to be so innocent when she goes away to Prague at the age of 20. But Olga, as a woman of color, growing up in New York, not super wealthy, who was abandoned by her mother and had a father who was living with addiction and ultimately died when she was young as well, doesn't have that luxury of remaining innocent or remaining girly until she wants to put that away. It was kind of forced out of her at a fairly young age. But the book shows how she's able to reconnect with these things. And I think that's an interesting thought to leave us with at the end, where Olga Dies Dreaming kind of shows us that girlhood and womanhood don't necessarily have to be completely oppositional states that necessitate a traumatic rupture in order to pass from one to the other. That it is possible to find independence and stand on your own 2 feet and become an adult without letting go of these softer, girlier parts. And even if you did have to lose them, that it is possible to rediscover that later on. And it's kind of a hopeful thought for the future, saying, maybe we don't all have to either yearn to be girls even as we near 30, or feel as if we have to become women too early to deal with the pressures of life. Maybe it can be just as simple as growing up. Thanks for watching, and I hope I'll see you in one of my future videos.